Hello and welcome. We will start with module 6 today. Module 6 will focus on syntax, which is basically we will look at the sentence structure and their properties, the rules and how children acquire sentences, sentence structure, within that how the smaller aspects of it, all of that we will cover today. So far we have looked at, we started building up from the time the child is able to understand the sounds of their language, of all languages, followed by only their own language, and then we moved on to speech segmentation. We also looked at word acquisition and so on. So, now of course, the logical next step will be for them to start speaking in sentences. So, this is where syntax comes into play. This is a broad roadmap that we will follow. We will start with the problems that children have with respect to speaking in sentences or learning sentences, and then how the major theories of the field of the domain help us understand those problems and their solutions. So, primarily we will look at nativist and the constructivist theories of language learning here, sentence structure. Lecture 2 will cover syntactic development and then followed by constraints on productivity, morphosyntactic dependency, movement dependency and so on. So, this is a broad roadmap. However, sometimes it might so happen that we are not entirely able to not entirely able to stick to the lecture. Sometimes lecture 1 might spill over to lecture 2 and so on. So, but this is broadly the topics that we will be covering, even if not a very airtight compartment. So, the beginning, when does it all start? We have seen how understanding sounds starts in the very beginning, from the few days after birth. They have been the infants have been seen to be able to distinguish sounds. So, when do syntax make an appearance? So, around 2 years of age, children begin to produce multi-word utterances. Before that, it is single word utterances. Now, we are reaching at the multi-word utterances. So, they start by putting words together when they have roughly a vocabulary of 50 words. Around that time, of course, there might be individual differences and across languages also, but this is the estimate that typically we have, that around the time they have 50 words, 60 words, they start putting one word after another and try to create a longer utterance. So, this is typically considered the first stage of syntax acquisition in production. Remember, we talked about the difference between comprehension and production. So, in all stages of their language acquisition, it is always the comprehension preceding the production. Production happens a little later. Similarly, the same structure applies for syntax as well. So, when they start putting two words together to create some sort of a phrase, that is when the production starts. That is when we say that they are able to produce sentences. However, the comprehension even in this case predates the production. So, because they are just beginning to put two words together. So, this is the sentence structures are of course very short as opposed to adult speech. So, typically 2 words, sometimes 3 words, this will be the length of the sentences that we see. So, this is the utterances will be consisting largely of open class lexical elements. That is how these are the characteristic features. So, largely based on open class. So, you will have nouns and verbs and adjectives, but what will be missing is the closed class elements like articles, auxiliaries, preposition, conjunction. So, all those things will be missing. Generally, they are not there at this stage in the very beginning. So, it is only the words. So, the 2 nouns or could be 1 noun, 1 verb and like this. So, inflections are also missing, like the plural marker or depending on the language, various kinds of markers that you have, inflectional morphology, those things are also missing. So, this speech is called telegraphic speech, and then eventually they make sentences. From this stage they go on to the to creating further slightly more difficult sentence structure, more longer sentence structure and so on, but they still have, they are still shorter than adult speech, and this is the time when they this is the stage where they are said to be learning syntax. Now, what is syntax? Syntax is the way sentences are formed in any given language. The rules of forming sentences in a given language is roughly what we call as syntax. Now, why is this important? Let us go to now, I am sure all of you have read Lewis Carroll's work. So, this is from his work where the poem Jabberwocky is quoted here. You can see this is a complete nonsense. None of the words is actually an existing word, but they have been arranged in such a way it looks like a poem. So, it was brilliant and the silvery and slithy tubes. It goes like this. So, none of them is a word, but nicely organized in a poetic format, and then Alice says, the poem somehow fills my head with ideas, only I do not know what exactly they are. So, it feels like you understand this because it has a structure. So, that is the very reason. So, even if it is entirely a complete nonsense, but it still makes you feel there is a sense to it. That is where syntax comes into play, because it follows the canonical sentence structure of English language. So, it is organized in that way, as a result of which you feel there must be a subject, there must be an object, there must be some action happening somewhere in the sentence. It is only that I am not exactly able to point out, but it is there, that kind of feeling you get. However, if you change that structure from the canonical to a non-canonical way, even if the words do not make any sense, we do not know what is a noun, which is a verb, or whatever there is there in this structure, still if you just play with the structure a little bit and create this kind of an output, then you will that I almost understand feeling will leave you, because the sentences are not, now it is completely this is Jabberwocky completely. So, it is not making any sense. So, this is where syntax comes in. Syntax is the way, the meaningful way of putting one word after another and making some sense. So, following syntactic rules are essential aspect of learning language. So, you cannot just get away by learning the sounds and the words, morphology and the words, but you need to also learn the rules of the sentences. So, typically like all the other factors that we have seen so far, this is also something typically developing children master exactly at the time they are supposed to master it. So, there is a kind of an universal trajectory through which children go, whether it is learning the sounds, learning the words, learning the sentences, everything. So, this does not seem to be a problem. There is a period where they have there are mistakes, as we will shortly see, mistakes, the kind of errors that they make as they are getting there. So, there is a wobbly start somewhere, but over a period of time that also is taken care of. So, they finally manage to speak in perfectly grammatical way in a very short span of time. So, the question now we are asking is how that happens. Like all the previous modules we have seen, we are asking the question how the child does what it does, because the entire mechanism of learning to speak in a language into which you are born comes so naturally, and it is such a rapid kind of a progression. The child manages to speak already around the age of 1, and by 2 they are already making small sentences, and it goes really quite fast. So, how do they do this? This is the focus of this module. So, let us start with some of the typical features of telegraphic speech. We have already seen some of them. For example, we have already discussed that telegraphic speech, that is when they speak in 2 words, they have they typically tend to use whole words only. So, the content words, nouns and verbs and adjectives like this, they will be omitting most of the time, they will omit the function words, they will omit inflections. This is how it typically starts. So, it looks like, because it looks like a telegram, in old times there used to be something called telegram. So, where there was only the content words and no inflection, none of those auxiliaries, nothing will be there. So, that is how it got the name telegraphic speech. So, then we also see some other kinds of errors, that seems to be universal. Mastering negation, for example, takes a bit of a time. Negation is a kind of a type of structure where languages of course differ. So, you have the simple negative versus the prohibitive negative, and then depending on the language the structure will differ, so on. So, typically in English utterances we see this kind of errors, no go movies, I know like it. So, the in this kind of a sentence I do not we need a I do not like it. So, there has to be this kind of a structure, but they just know how to put a not there. So, I know like it. This is a very common structure. Similarly, complex sentences are difficult, that takes some time before they arrive at complex sentence with relative clause. The dog that chased the cat was barking. And passives are also another problem zone. There is where they are slightly slow in learning, in picking it up and using it as well. Of course, there are language specific problems. So, an example will be the cat was chased by the dog. So, this is a passive construction. Not in English language especially, it has been seen that children take a little bit of time to master the passive structure. However, these things are, these structures are or the let us say the mastery of these structures are language specific. Not all children from all languages exhibit the same kind of problems. So, as I was just saying that the data I was talking about comes from primarily from English, but if we look around, if we look at other languages, this might not be the case. For example, this is what we have found in the literature, that English, German and Hebrew, in case of children from these languages, even 11-year-old children rarely use passive, because it is not a canonical structure, we do not need to use it. Just because grammar has that possibility does not really mean we need to use it, it is there, it is a structure that is possible. So, even 11-year-olds were found to be using them very rarely. However, certain languages make it more prevalent, make it more common, or let us say more high frequency kind of a structure. For example, one language that literature typically gives example of is that of Sesotho, which uses passive structure very often. So, children you will start using them even as young as 2 years of age. In Italian, 3-year-olds use relative clause more often than English ones. So, it is actually a language specific property. It may not be always true that all children across all languages will find negation, passive and the relative clauses difficult. Another very well known case of telegraphic speech and a well known feature of telegraphic speech is that of the case of root infinitives. Root infinitives seem to be a very common feature across languages. So, this is where the child's first sentences show the use of root infinitives in the sense that the verb is not inflected, because as we just discussed that telegraphic speech does not have the inflections, often they lack the inflections. So, as a result the root verb is used as it is, and that is found in many languages of the world. As some examples from here I have quoted from the authors. So, for example, in this case this is a Danish example by a child 2 years of age. So, what this sentence basically means is she sleeps infinitive. So, this is the infinitive form of the verb that he uses in this case. So, the infinitive form of the verb to sleep. Similarly, in the French example as well, this is a child named Daniel, 1 year and 11 months old, uses the same kind of a structure. So, little baby sleep. So, the sleep is the infinitive form of the verb to sleep is utilized here. Similar examples we also have from Dutch. This is a child 2 years and 6 months of age, again the same kind of thing, and similarly you go all the languages. So, German and then Russian and we have Dutch. So, in many languages seem to have the same kind of structure, where children when they are speaking in telegraphic speech, that is 2-word sentences or 2 to 3-word sentences, this seem to use the root infinitives very often. Root infinitives meaning the verb will be used in its infinitive form, which is a root form. Similarly, yet another very common feature is that of null subject, which is basically omitting the subject, in case of a sentence, short sentence by the kids. So, this happens even in those languages where it is not common in the adult speech. So, is it a problem? Is it something that they do not understand? Why do they drop the subject marker? That is another question that syntacticians have been asking, and this again happens around around the same time in children's speech, when the root infinitive structure also appears. So, around the same age. So, for example, you have this kind of a sentence like fold in the briefcase. This is from an example, this is from a child named Eve, 1 year 10 months, and this is from Brown 1973. Similarly, this is a Danish example where they are not using the noun, not using the subject. Similarly, again first little book read. So, who is reading the little book? No, that is not mentioned. Then goes under the stool and all of that. Not drive tractor. So, who is not driving the tractor? The subject is not there. Similarly, like helicopter clean, all of that. So, even they are not using the subject. So, this is called the case of null subjects in telegraphic speech. See, this is also a very common occurrence. However, again like the previous case we saw, this is also not entirely uniform, even though we see many cases, but it is not entirely uniform, that the differences typically occur or the let us say the frequency of occurrences, it depends on various factors. They can be individual children, they can be across languages, sometimes even within the same child across time. So, the same child might be sometimes using the proper structure with the subject, sometimes the same child might omit the subject. So, there are variations that have been reported in the literature in case of null subject as well. Again the sentence length, we started by saying that these sentences that children uttered at this stage are very short, like 2 words or 3 words. So, but then that is also not exactly universal. So, in this case vocabulary might differ, and some as a result some cases their sentence structures might also differ. So, for example, this is a sentence from by an Italian 2.5 years old girl. She produces a rather long sentence which in English the translation in English would be teeth get washed after eating, right mama, not before. So, it is a rather long and slightly complex sentence for a 2.5-year-old girl. So, but on the other hand, an English boy, same age English boy is creating a sentence like, daddy, can you help me find it please. So, this kind of sentences. So, it is not always like children will be using only 2 words or 3 years through 3 words. They are also sometimes capable of creating sentences which are pretty lengthy. So, the gist of the matter till here is that syntactic development of children has many complex aspects, and it is not always a linear sort of a thing. So, it is not like 2 words and then 3 words and then 4 words, and this will be the case everywhere. Of course, there are some amount of universality, but then there are also lot of variations across the languages, across children, within the same language, even within the same child across different time. So, similarities and differences between the target grammar and the child's grammar might differ at different points. Children occasionally use grammatical morphemes in the early 2 word stage, but often omit them. So, this is what we mean by even within the same child there might be differences. So, if they are not using certain grammatical morphemes, does not mean that they do not know, because they might be using in some other constructions. So, that is what that is why I say that this is not a linear development. There are various kinds of complex layers of things that happen, and of course, differences across languages that are always there. Then to understand all of these, there are two primary domains that have been looked at, that has been investigated within this. So, there are two probable approaches. So, the questions approaches to these questions differ, and they typically will cover the notions on both acquisition mechanism as well as the syntactic representation. So, what do the child, what the children already have in part as part of their innate grammar, what do they already know? How is it represented? How is that syntactic knowledge represented in their mind? That is one domain. The other domain, of course, connected is the acquisition mechanism. So, depending on these two notions, there are different approaches. The primarily two main approaches we will be discussing. So, one is called the maturational aspect, the other is called the continuity approach. Maturational approach and continuity approach are kind of opposed to each other. So, maturational account looks at the development of the syntactic knowledge over a period of time. So, they start due to the because it is focused mostly on the maturational stages. So, as a result of which the child starts simple, and over a period of time they build up on their knowledge and then eventually acquire the target language structure. So, the child's grammar and the target grammar hence are not the same in the very beginning. Now, why does it happen? It happens because the child's development, language development in syntactic development in this case will be based on, or let us say dependent on, the neuronal maturation as well. So, there are two theoretical positions that that adopts this view. One is of course, the usage based approach, and the other is generative structure building approach. So, the main argument here is that children build up the representations of their target language incrementally. So, if that is the case, if they are not born with the entire structure intact and they build up incrementally on as they go, after the structure A they learn the structure B and so on. So, then this solves the problem of the disparity between early representation and the target structure. Why in the beginning they speak the way they speak, and why they ultimately over a period of time only they start to have the complex structure in place, and that is a given, that already happens. So, this maturational account takes care of that problem pretty easily. On the other hand, we have something called continuity approach. Continuity approach does not assume any maturationally induced changes, any all the changes that happen from, let us say, starting at 1 year 10 months to 2.5 years, 3 years, that those changes are there for us to see, but they do not believe that those changes are because of some kind of a maturationally induced qualitative change. Rather, it is because of it is due to some other reasons. They believe in, the theoretical position believes in full competence or strong continuity approach, and they assume that adult like structure syntactic representations are already there even in the early stages, even in the stage where they are only speaking in 2 words. So, the entire structure is already there, even though they are not able to produce it as such. At an underlying level, at the deeper level, the representation is already there. So, why do they speak? Why do they make those mistakes that they do? Why do they speak the way they do? As per this approach, the initial deviations from the target language occurs due to other factors, not because they need to mature or learn, but because there are other problems. Which are the problems? Problems with morphophonological realization, lexical gap, interface between morphology and syntax, the discourse conditions for the realization of the morphosyntactic properties, and so on. So, it is not like the structure is not there, structure is already there, the representation is already there, but in order for them to realize it, they need to take into account another all these other problems, and that is why we see that in the beginning they do not approximate the target structure the way they should. So, these are the problems. Now, overall if we see the child's language acquisition, there are a few very well known problems, major problems that depending on whichever theory you are talking about, all the theories are considered these problems as the most important problems to solve. So, we will look at them one by one. First problem is called the logical problem of language acquisition. It is also called the famous poverty of stimulus, and there are other names also given to it, and this is something that is a very well known problem, that how do children learn to speak perfectly grammatical sentences even though the stimulus is not so rich, not always so rich. So, children receive a very small arbitrary sample of their target language as input, because you see no child gets a very systematic kind of an input. So, no parent unless they are linguists, I doubt even linguists parents who are linguists also speak like that to the children. So, there is no methodical way of speaking to a child when the child is beginning to speak in words and 2 word stages or whatever. There is no structured input that they get. What they get is very in a very scattered way, in arbitrary way, and a very small size of small sample that they actually get as input. But they learn to produce, understand and judge an infinite number of sentences and sentence structure. So, this is the famous poverty of stimulus problem. So, if children are able to arrive at the complex structure of their language in spite of such small number of inputs, that means they are able to that means they have innate knowledge of the structure, and also they are able to generalize based on those innate knowledge. So, this was the primary most important point of argument that Chomsky had forwarded in his criticism of verbal behavior. So, this is and the same problem we are discussing now, that they are not able to, it cannot be that their learning of sentences, sentence structure, a language as a whole cannot be dependent upon them learning it from the environment, because the input is just not sufficient. That is the problem. Now, if there is an innate knowledge already existing there, and all they need to do is generalize or apply the same rule to everything, then we have a different problem. What is that problem? That problem is about generalization, and generalization might take actually two different at least two different kinds of trajectories. So, if children need to learn from limited input based on some innate rule, they have the risk of generalization. This generalization can be either restrictive or it can be a matter of over generalization. Restrictive generation is something like the target might contain structures that are not covered by the child's generalization. For example, in case of Hindi, let us say, Hindi speaking children hearing sentences with overt subject noun phrase may incorrectly generalize that in all cases Hindi will have overt subject marking. Right. This is the case with many other languages also, but Hindi is closer home. So, if the child is hearing sentences in the input that there are the subject is always overtly marked, or the child is producing the generalization thinking that this is the only way of using Hindi sentences. So, but this may or may not be the case. In Hindi at least it is possible to drop, you can simply say khana kha liya. So, of course, maine khana kha liya is the canonical structure, but it is equally possible, it is equally common to say khana kha liya, even it is understood, the subject is understood in the context, who has eaten. So, this is a case of what is called the restrictive case of generalization. The other side is also possible, the opposite is also possible, which is a case of over generalization. Over generalization happens when children have learned to create sentences on their own by learning the pattern, but still do not know how to pick the correct verbs or nouns, etc. So, they tend to over generalize the rules. So, they have learned the rules and the same rules they apply everywhere, but that is not there are some cases where they will not apply, there will be exceptions. Because they have not yet learned the exceptions, they tend to over generalize. So, I spilled the carpet with juice. So, I have painted the box with color. If they have learned that kind of a structure, So, they know that this is possible. You can that there will be an agent, they will be doing something something with something, that kind of a structure if they have, and they create a sentence like this: I spilled the carpet with juice. This is an example of overgeneralization, because it is not possible to English does not allow this kind of a sentence structure. Similarly, don't giggle me, I said her no. So, this kind of structure. So, there are some cases where this kind of structure will be fine. If you omit, if you change the verb in don't giggle me, don't trouble me, don't irritate me, can be fine, but don't giggle me is not correct. But this is an example of overgeneralization. So, this is one possibility, and this is one problem that the theories need to take into account. Another problem is the what is famously called the developmental problem. Now, this problem is related to the time course of syntactic development. Children tend to go through similar stages of development across the world's languages. Of course, we can see some amount of inter-participant, inter-individual and inter-language differences, but there are an overarching structure that seems to hold for almost all languages. Children are speaking almost all languages. So, that is another problem that we need to that the theories need to address. Now, why is it a problem? Because languages differ. Different kinds of languages have different kinds of structures. So, at the very root, you can talk about the word order difference. So, SOV versus SVO versus VSO, all kinds of word orders are possible. But even in spite of that, some languages are noun class languages, some are classifier languages. There are various kinds of differences that hold across the world's languages, but we still see some sort of a pattern there. So, that is why it is important to keep in mind while theorizing about how the children master syntax. Then we have another well known problem called the bootstrapping problem. A bootstrapping problem is a kind of a circular problem. The syntactic rules operate on syntactic categories. So, in syntactic categories, as in the category of subject or the object or the verb, these are the syntactic categories. So, rules apply only on the category of verbs or nouns, but not the words per se. So, children need to first figure out which is noun and which is verb to start with in a sentence. However, this knowledge is contingent upon the knowledge of sentence structure itself. Unless and until you learn that there is something called a sentence, and a sentence includes a noun and a verb and whatever else depending on the language, until and unless you know that, the child will not be able to arrive at the syntactic categories. But again, as we can see, without the understanding the noun and verb, they cannot learn the sentence structure as well. So, this is a circular problem, and this is why this is how Pinker put it, that this is called a bootstrapping problem, because the child must somehow lift himself up by his bootstraps to even get started. So, this is a very interesting problem in syntax. They have to know the sentence to understand the sentence structure. So, this is a problem that typically all theories will need to talk about, they need to discuss about. And other problems at hand will be, let us say, verbs do not always denote action. We have seen when we are talking about learning words, learning nouns were comparatively easy as opposed to learning verbs, and how learning verbs automatically needs takes you to the learning of sentences to some extent. If you understand that X is done to Y, so there is a verb that needs an object. There is an agent, there is an object on which the action happens, and so on. But there are cases where verbs do not actually denote action. What will happen there? For example, we also have verbs of thought, verbs of feeling, and so on. So, to know is also to know, to think, to love, and all these are also verbs. So, they do not always occupy at the same position in the sentence either, especially in languages like say Hindi. Hindi has a free word order. We can say the same thing in 4 different ways. मैंने खाना खाया, खाना मैंने खाया, khaya maine khana, all kinds of possibilities. Of course, there are different kinds of semantic overtones, there are some extra information that you are giving, but at the very basic level, at the structural level, there are possibilities of changing the position of the components in the sentence. So, you cannot always depend on the position in the sentence of the words in order to understand which is a verb. Similar, and at the same time, verbs also carry a lot of extra information like tense, aspect, mood marking, etc., etc. So, this is a complex problem that we have at hand. Now, these are some of the problems, of course, because we have only we are devoting only one module for syntax here. So, I have put together only a few of the most well known problems, and we will now look at how theories try to tackle these problems. So, we are now going to theories, syntactic theories. So, we are again asking the same question that we have been asking so far in all cases, how children learn language, how children learn words, how children learn sounds. Now, we are at how do children learn syntax. So, is but here the primary motivating factor, the primary question, the primary point of departure is the main question, that whether the knowledge is innate or is it not. Based on that, of course, we have again the three kinds of theories. We have the idea of imitation, that children learn sentence structure also on the basis of imitation. So, whatever they hear, they repeat, they imitate the adult speech and thereby they learn. Then we have nativist theory of innateness, which is generativism, and then constructivist theory. Children they build up the understanding bottom up as they learn, as they go by, starting with the small 2-word sentences and then the 3 words, and as they go they learn. That is, these are the three theories. In the beginning also we talked about 3 theories. So, we are revisiting them, and let us see now how things go. So, behaviorism, taking behaviorism as the first one. This theory says that children learn by whatever they hear around them. So, imitation is the most important fundamental point of departure here. Now, if this has to be true, we will not be able to understand a novel construction as grammatical. We have talked about the poverty of stimulus already. So, we will not be discussing it again, but let us say often we hear new sentences, new kind of construction, novel construction, and children, very young children are able to judge grammaticality of novel sentences. Now, how does it happen? Because they have never heard the sentence before. So, if the input, if imitation is the key, then they would not be able to either produce novel sentences nor comprehend novel sentences, but they do. So, this idea then it will not be very tenable. Now, this nor we will be able to generate novel structure as we just said. So, for example, famous example by Chomsky, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, sleep green colorless furious ideas. So, this kind of a sentence is as you all know, he gave this example to say that if you ask somebody, some child, some small child, whether the sentences are grammatical or not, even though the sentence means nothing, it is completely novel because they do not exist, such things do not exist, but the child will be able to judge the sentences correctly. So, in the first case this sentence is grammatically correct even though it has no meaning, but the second sentence is ungrammatical. This is how we denote ungrammatical sentences with an asterisk. So, they will be able to say that the second sentence is grammatically incorrect. This is what the idea here is against behaviorism. So, children learn a system of syntactic structure that helps them generate rather than imitate. So, behaviorism was decided to be not very tenable, was already kind of trashed by generative theories. So, we are just revisiting because we will not be carrying this forward. So, how children learn? Children learn because there is some kind of a mechanism, innate mechanism, and that helps them generate rather than imitate, because imitation does not take you very far. So, they learn, for example, the cat can be combined with a determiner like a or the. So, the cat, This can combine with a verb phrase, that is running. So, the cat is running. Verb phrase for example, is running. So, now the sentence becomes the cat is running. The noun phrase can be replaced by a pronoun. So, it becomes he is running and so on. So, this is not the child does not do any limitation here, but the child is merely following the rule of the game, that is how they learn the language. So, that is the idea. So, this and because of this behaviorism is not tenable. So, we will not discuss behaviorism ahead. In the next lecture, we will look at primarily we will look at nativism followed by constructivism, how each of these theories are tackling the major problems that we have already discussed before, and thereby we will try to see which what are the evidence that the theories have received and what are the criticisms each of them have received. And then of course, we will also look at a comparison between these two theories and how what is the way ahead and how where we are today. So, yeah, so we will stop here today. Thank you.